Well, let me call this event to order. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the International Institute for Strategic Studies for our discussion today on opening up to Cuba, lessons from Canada. Today's event is different than some of the ones we usually do here, different in a couple ways, both in the subject matter and in what the event is all about, because it serves a dual purpose of both having a policy discussion, but it serves as a launching event for the rebranding of the Washington-based office of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. We've been known as IISS-US ever since we opened our office in Washington in 2001. But in the last few weeks, we've rebranded it as IISS Americas, as you can see in our signage in the office. The name reflects the broader responsibilities of our office to represent the Institute throughout North and South America and to continue to engage with policymaking communities, multilateral organizations, non-governmental organizations, and multinational corporations in this hemisphere. And I'm very pleased that joining us today for this event is former Canadian Ambassador to Cuba, Mark Entwistle, someone whose expertise encompasses both North and South America. He's been described as the leading Canadian expert on Cuba. As ambassador to Havana in the mid-1990s, he met Fidel Castro numerous times and spent probably 100 hours, he said, in conversations with him. Following 15 years of diplomatic service, including as spokesman for the Canadian Foreign Ministry and press secretary to the Prime Minister, Ambassador Entwistle has been involved in Cuba-related business for the past 19 years. He's currently a partner at Acosta Capital, a merchant bank based in Toronto, where he also serves as managing director of its specialist Cuba business group. His advisory work with U.S. firms has exploded with the thaw of U.S.-Cuba relations. And when I called you the leading Canadian expert on Cuba, I think we could probably say the leading North American expert on Cuba, since there aren't too many American experts, since we don't have relations, or we haven't had relations until recently. Yeah, so we're very glad that you could join us. This event will run until 3 o'clock. Ambassador Entwistle will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have some time for discussion and Q&A. Both the presentation and the discussion are all on the record and are being broadcast on our web page live, and will be there for anyone to see afterwards. So, Mark, over to you, please.
There we go. Mark, thanks very much. Delighted to be here. Trained as a career Foreign Service officer many years ago. I will have some remarks. You can't go anywhere without prepared remarks, but I will be fairly informal in delivering them, and I will move through them quite quickly. So I hope I don't speak too fast, and I will stay at a fairly kind of high level with a set of observations, and very, very happy to get into the weeds of any parts of Cuban reality that might be of interest to you. So thank you very much, Mark, for the invitation. It's of course a particular honor when Mark called me up and asked me if I would do this, because I do a fair amount of speaking in the United States on Cuba issues, especially after December 17th, 2014, which the Cubans called D17, for obvious reasons. But it's a particularly interesting one because, and it is an honor because of the rebranding of IISS Americas, and to talk about Cuba, which is in fact a country that has had or left an indelible footprint in the cultural and political life of this hemisphere for generations, and it continues to do so. Even when defined for 60-odd years in the United States as largely in the context of immigration policy and presidential electoral politics in the United States. Cuba has been in the rest of the hemisphere throughout that time, playing out a role and an influence in myriad ways, some fairly well known and of course others less publicly known. Cuba is a very difficult country to characterize. I don't know how many people have been in the room, but it's also at the same time very prone to easy caricature. And there are outsiders in particular who like to, or I think find it easier to process Cuba in black and white, really. It's rather a highly nuanced society. It's actually quite a kaleidoscopic patchwork of different realities that all exist simultaneously. Rather like, I've always likened it a bit to a diamond with its different facets, which will catch the light at different times. So folks will go to Cuba and visit for a few days and see a part of Cuba or reach pretty firm conclusions or ideas about what Cuba is. But you know, when those facets spin around another way, there's an entirely different reality to the place. So it's a little risky business, frankly, to jump to early conclusions about Cuba. And I have to say, as somebody who's been involved in the Cuba business and dealing and working with Cubans from all walks of life throughout Cuban society for a really long time, now actually almost 2.5 decades when you kind of add it all up, I have to say Cuba can still surprise me. Now the process which is underway between the United States and Cuba to build a more normal bilateral relationship is historic by any measure. I think the progress has been nothing short of remarkable in the time frame, 16, 17 odd months, and especially when one considers the wall of accumulated mistrust that's been built up and that towers over the effort. I personally don't use the verb to normalize. I know a lot of people do. And the reason I don't is because I don't believe there's ever actually been a normal relationship between the United States and Cuba. It's actually been really best described as a study in asymmetrical power over 200 years that's ranged from numerous attempts in through the 19th century to actually purchase Cuba from colonial Spain or to annex it in various ways, through a long period of economic, what can only be called economic and political hegemony in the Republic in Cuba, through revolution, and of course through a trade and investment embargo that is probably the most comprehensive yet devised by humankind. It really, through its extraterritorial reach, is a significant piece of an instrument of economic isolation or attempted isolation. But both Presidents Obama and Castro have committed, each equally in the face of their own domestic politics, and President Castro has his own domestic politics on this issue to navigate as well. They have committed to try to create a more a new and a more normal relationship. It's early in the process. Without question. They just did another bilateral commission. The work is ongoing, but it's early, and there are, as folks in this room probably realize, there are some pretty big 800-pound gorillas in the room, and some considerable lift still to take place. The continued existence of the embargo, for example, what to do eventually about the U.S. military presence at Guantanamo Bay on the national territory of a sovereign state. I'm not suggesting for a second that that's an issue that we'll get to anytime soon, but it's part of the landscape of a more normal relationship, how to compensate American entities and persons for the expropriation of their property as called for under international law, a regularized migration regime, and a more sophisticated and open conversation about human rights, for example, between the two countries. These are big pieces of work to do. But the progress, as I mentioned, has been remarkable. So I think, Mark asked me, are there any thoughts from my experience as a Canadian and a former ambassador and a business person where we don't have an embargo, and I go constantly. I'm there probably a week, a month. I've hundreds and hundreds of times been to Cuba. I lived through Cuba for 4 years. Is there any observations that might be interesting or useful as the United States continues down this path? Along with Mexico, Canada was the only country in the hemisphere and among NATO allies never to cut diplomatic relations with Cuba. So Canada's maintained unbroken relations for 70 years. There were times in the 1960s and 70s and 80s when Canadian envoys probably found themselves in quite odd company in Havana, where they would have been there with really alone with representatives of the Soviet bloc and a motley crew and selection of national liberation organizations, etc. But what it did do, the net result was that Canada really has had a front row seat throughout the Cuban journey, from the end of the Second World War through the military coup of Fulgencio Batista in 1952, through revolution, and through the breakup and disintegration of the Soviet Union to this day. I think, and as really a mini lifetime around, all things Cuban, including my time as ambassador and spending the time and in business and spending the time as a student of Cuban history, I've reached a number of conclusions about Cuba. And so I'd happy to share some of these at a fairly high level. Cuba is so nuanced and so complex that I'll just kind of touch lightly, but as I mentioned earlier, I'm very happy and look forward to dig a little deeper into any of these rabbit holes in a Q&A after these remarks. I think my conclusions relate principally to two broad themes, which I could summarize as follows. One around the words understanding and attitude on one hand, and then what I would call at the end kind of the limits to leverage on the other hand. So to begin to understand Cuba, a useful way to go about it may be to spend some time looking at what Cuba is, and equally so what Cuba is not. As I mentioned, it's very easy to caricature, and the what Cuba is not piece, I think, is equally as important. What it is, I believe, one of the most unique and distinct countries and societies on the planet. It's historically a hybrid society that fuses Spanish tradition and culture from the colonial period with, of course, African influence from the slave trade, which formed or was the enabler of the sugar monoculture that defined and frankly distorted the economic history of Cuba for more than 2 centuries. When you add to that the relationship, given the geographical proximity with the United States, and also almost 2 centuries of trade and commerce and political interventionism through the history of Cuba, Cuba is a country that has, for example, it has American English words all through. It's slang, it's street slang. It's we know this is a country obsessed with baseball, not soccer. All Cubans, regardless of whether it's a Lada or one of the old cars that you will see there, all cars are called Chevys. For example, Cuba's strewn with the kind of the debris of the relationship with the United States, and the whole baseball. The history of how Cubans chose baseball is interesting, which I won't bore you with right now, but I'd be happy to explain to you later. Then, of course, there's a Russian influence from the time of the Cold War up until 1991 or so. Cuba is peppered with individuals with names, like Sergei and Vladimir, because their parents were Russians who stayed. You had Chinese laborers built the Cuban National Railway, for example, and many of them stayed. Plantation owners fled Haiti in the 1802 slave revolution, and they all skedaddled over to Cuba, where Cienfuegos, for example, they helped construct the city of Cienfuegos, which has very strong French influence. So a very famous Cuban anthropologist, Fernando Ortiz, described Cuba as really a cultural stew. And the reason why this is important is that it's provided Cuba with a very deep-rooted structural capacity to absorb and adapt to change. Cubans are, I would call them in a way, kind of culturally ambidextrous. Cuba is also a country of great economic potential, which is the reason why American business has been, for the last year or over a year, in some considerable frenzy about Cuba as a market. We know all about it. It's 11.5 million people. It's a large country, highly educated, virtually no illiteracy, rich human capital that supports domestic knowledge sectors like biotech, information technology, 14 universities, 2 IT universities, et cetera, fertile agriculture, extensive mineral resources, virtually untapped to date tourism sector. Cuba is also a country in evolution, without question. As even President Raul Castro told the recent Congress of the Communist Party, the ruling party, it's changing before our eyes. Just today, there's announcements that they are going to legalize with legal structure, legal entities, which had not happened yet, the emerging private sector in Cuba. This is of quite fundamental importance. So Cuba is changing before our eyes. But the product of the evolution will be quintessentially Cuban. Cuba is an assimilator culture, and it always has been historically. It's unrelated to the revolutionary period. And to deploy a kind of good old-fashioned Canadian hockey metaphor, the Cubans will cherry pick. They'll cherry pick from models that they like. They'll take things that they like or they don't like. You often hear a fair amount of chatter that Cuba will follow a China model or a Vietnam model. The fact is it will be neither. They will create something quite uniquely Cuban. The only model that they really talk about in any explicit terms is Russia, and it's as a negative morality story. The Cuban perception of Russia has been that uncontrolled change created a vacuum into which flowed organized crime and the creation of an oligarch class. So never will that happen in Cuba. Has been a mantra of the Cuban political leadership for years. And if they were sitting here, they would say the exact same thing. The political leadership in Cuba has been very explicit for a long time that much of the revolutionary economic model has not worked and must be adjusted. And this includes a small but growing private sector, which in fact the Cuban state created itself as a means to remove hundreds of thousands of Cubans from the state payroll for unproductive jobs, and in areas and sectors where the state wishes to exit from many economic functions and services to which, frankly, it's not best suited. But these adjustments, if you will, I don't use, by the way, reforms and things. They're a bit too grandiose for the Cuban context. Cubans are calibrators and adjusters. And but these changes, many of which can be quite significant, they'll be undertaken in this very Cuban, very kind of steady and controlled pace, managing perceptions of risk at each stage. And I think this is really the hallmark of Cuban evolution. So it means that people who are looking for a kind of an immediate, big bang, kind of radical, deep structural change in Cuba will only be disappointed. And the extrapolation of that kind of sort of our unilateral wishful thinking onto Cuba is actually wholly disconnected from the reality of the island. The Cubans have chosen to proceed in a certain pace and sequencing, not because they're not interested in change where required, but they've made a conscious decision to do it in this way. Cuba is a very complex economy. In fact, it's several economies that exist simultaneously, and they're all pressed up against each other. The largest share of the value in the Cuban economy by far still lies in state corporations, although these are companies that look very, very different than the old Soviet command and control style economy, which has been largely broken up in Cuba. They're expected to make money and to be profitable. In reality, of course, the state quite reluctantly continues to subsidize many of the underperforming companies, and cash liquidity challenges are a constraint for the development of these state firms. There's a small and growing private sector. This is the sector we hear about a lot in North America, especially in the United States. It has two component parts. There's what are called the cuentapropistas. These are people who, as the Spanish term implies, these are people who work for themselves. This is effectively small business. These are restaurant owners and cafes and all of that kind of stuff. And then there's also a cooperative movement which began in agriculture and has moved into the urban economy, and these are effectively Cuban-style quasi-privatizations and really management takeovers by employees, where the state is ceding control and creating private companies to be owned by their employees. About 30% of Cubans now work in these private sector entities. There's also actual private agriculture, largely in the tobacco growing regions of Pinar del Rio in the west of the country, where farmers own their own property, they own their own farms. Then to add to this jigsaw puzzle, it's important just to understand how all this swirls around in Cuba. To add to this, there's also several other things. There's the creation of special economic zones. There's one currently created at Mariel. These are not tax-free zones. These are really industrial development areas where 100% foreign-owned businesses can be established by law. And there's also the role played in the Cuban economy by companies owned, whose beneficial owner is the Cuban military through a large and vertically integrated holding company. On top of all of that, you have two currencies that exist simultaneously. You have the Cuban national peso, of course, and you have the convertible peso, the famous CUC, the CUC. Although the unification of the currency into a single new national peso has begun and is underway now after many, many years, I must say, of study and analysis. Cuba is open for business, but in a very, very specific context. The Cuban Foreign Investment Law that was adopted with its various enabling regulations in the spring of 2014 was especially important, less for the content of it, although that's important too. It did sweeten the pie or the pot for foreign investors, but it was particularly important because it confirmed that Cuba was returning to the global capital markets as the best way to safeguard sustainable economic development. Cuba had earlier a not altogether satisfactory experience with foreign investors in the mid-1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the quite intricate Comic-Con trading and commercial system, and those of you old enough to remember all this stuff, collapsed. And in reaction to that experience, partly with kind of a Wild West frontierland version of foreign investment, they really retreated into state-to-state investment relationships for most of the 2000s. But now the ambivalence to direct foreign investment has been replaced by recognition that access to capital and markets is crucial. So the debate within the foreign investment authorities in Cuba is essentially the following: how much of the national economy to share, at what valuation, and with what foreign partner. On the other hand, what Cuba is not a number of things. Cuba in 2016 is not Cuba of the 1950s. It's a rather more independent country with a greater appreciation of the value of its national assets, and where Cuban national identity has, in my opinion, evolved over the past 6 decades. Cubans have now, for example, grown to expect a universal healthcare and education system as part of what it means to be Cuban. Cuba is not an isolated country. It's not a kind of Caribbean hermit kingdom. It's rather a very hustle-bustle country, very connected to the world. The Cubans have options in their partnerships. Despite all of its development challenges, Cuba is not an unstable country. In studies conducted at one of the Canadian universities that ranked all the countries of the world in terms of political stability against a range of criteria, Cuba was ranked pretty much right in the middle, ahead of a number of nations with whom, we both Canada and the United States maintain quite normal and active relationships. There's actually a quite remarkable social cohesion in Cuba that really transcends political differences, where, and this may sound obvious, but I think it's really important for understanding Cuba, where all Cubans are fiercely patriotic and nationalist, equally in the Cuban Catholic Church, equally in the Cuban Communist Party, which are the two large kind of pan-Cuban national institutions, or whether you're in the Cuban Jewish community, across the spectrum. It's, I think, a pretty fundamental mistake to assume that there's this kind of raw dichotomy in Cuban society in terms of the Cuban people on one side versus the state or the regime. That doesn't at all capture the reality of Cuba, which is infinitely more nuanced, where, for example, you could have a cuentapropista restaurant owner who is also a member of the Communist Party of Cuba. And these apparent contradictions coexist in the Cuban psyche, where those who desire greater economic liberalization, more space, also worry at the same time about the social costs of uncontrolled change. And I encounter this kind of quite complex moral landscape in Cuba all the time, where all of these kind of contradictory instincts all exist simultaneously. I think I've always believed that, in fact, there is a loose and broad, but a social contract in Cuba between the state and the Cuban people, based on a number of conditions, which, though at the end of the day conveys a degree of political legitimacy to the state in the absence of multi-party democratic elections. I'm sure there are some who may not accept that, but I believe that it's pretty core to understanding contemporary Cuba. Cuba is not hurtling towards capitalism, despite cover stories over the last year or two from even the quite august Economist magazine, which had that blaring as its cover story, or Newsweek, which right after the December 17th announcements, 2014, pronounced, Viva Capitalismo, right after those announcements. And I think the subtext of that kind of perception also is a risky one for understanding Cuba, because it really it implies that somehow Cuba is among kind of the last holdouts of the Cold War to collapse under the weight of failure of a revolutionary model, and that in some way the West has won something. There's a kind of triumphalist note to this, to that kind of narrative. But it also, I think, really belies a pretty fundamental misunderstanding of Cuba and Cuban history, because in many ways the Cubans are in the place that they are for a whole bunch of reasons, because they've chosen in many ways to be there. I also think the communist label's a distraction. Cuba is infinitely more a product of its own history than any ideological dogma. I mean, after all, the old Communist Party of Cuba, which was really taken over in a hostile takeover by Fidel Castro in 1960 or so. But the old Communist Party of Cuba played a fundamental and important role in the political history of the country in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. It was a player in Cuban politics. There were two communist ministers in the wartime government of Fulgencio Batista from 1940 to 1944. The current Cuban government frames its narrative in terms of historic Cuban nationalism, channeling, the father of the Cuban nation, José Martí, and a range of other symbols of Cuban patriotism. When I refer earlier to the idea of attitude, what I was really looking at are two basic themes that I've seen at play in my experience, certainly with business in Cuba over many years. Firstly, to be successful in dealing with the Cubans, I think engagement in Cuba must be strategic. in the kind of quite pure, true sense of the word. It's a country for those with a long-term horizon and a really quite strategic approach to this. This is not for speculators. It's not for hedge fund guys. It's not for those who are focused on kind of extrapolating their wishful thinking onto Cuba. If only they would do this and do that, it's a win-win, etc. Or whose plan is to kind of wait out the Cubans until they come to their senses and see the light of the path that, of course, we've chosen for them, because frankly, that could be quite a long wait. And the other watchword that I think is important regarding Cuba is participation. And the Cuban worldview is predicated on the fact that they want to participate in the value creation in their own economy, whether it be at the macro state level or down to the private entrepreneur level. And the whole Cuban foreign investment regime is structured in this way. So they're looking for commercial investment partners, political partners, who will contribute jointly in the economic development of their country and who will share jointly in the benefits, but who are not. This is not about buying things. I've seen already quite large American companies, big, iconic, huge, massive American companies, stumble in Cuba early out of the gate, who are interested in the Cuban market clearly, but very early on they failed to understand this very basic tenet of Cuba. The Cubans want to participate in the value of their own country. It's not a fireside sale. So, Mark, let me just talk very briefly about a last conclusion that I've drawn after many years in Cuba and around Cuba, and it relates to what I mentioned earlier and what I call the limits to leverage. I think we spent a lot of time over the past years arguing about what approach would be more successful in effecting internal political change in Cuba, whether it be the Canadian policy of constructive engagement, which we had undertook for 70 years, or certainly for 50 years, almost 60 years in the revolutionary period, or the isolationist embargo policy pursued by the United States, which is still effectively in place, of course, even in this quite current, I must say, kind of awkward gray zone that we're in, where you have a diplomatic relationship, but yet the economic embargo still exists effectively in place. And embargoes are acts of economic aggression or warfare, actually, because they're intended to be punitive. So it's a very this awkward, and all sides are trying to grope their way through and it'll take some time to get all this synced up. But when I was in the Canadian Foreign Service, we spent a lot of time on this issue, sort of what approach worked best, and et cetera. And I've concluded that, frankly, the truth is absolutely neither. And I think the further truth is that the assumptions underlying such approaches are absolutely disconnected from the realities of Cuba itself, and frankly, irrelevant. I think you could probably count, for example, in the fingers of one hand, the people in Cuba who actually listen to, for example, Radio Marti. At the risk of sounding like a cliche, Cubans on the island will decide the future of Cuba among themselves. I believe that this is, in fact, profoundly true because of much of what I described earlier. Cuban society is much more cohesive than outsiders assume or believe or wish to believe. And the Cuban psychological landscape easily straddles various desires and ambitions that coexist, even in contradiction. And as they've done so many times in the past, the Cubans will construct their own uniquely Cuban future. I believe they do not, in fact, want outsiders to intervene, to try to wedge apart different segments of their society. And I include in this they, even those who disagree politically with the current revolutionary government. When I first arrived in Havana in the early 1990s, Cuba was in an economic tailspin. It was in the so-called special period, in the rather Kafkaesque Cuban linguistic construction of these things. It was the a special period of war in a time of peace, which was the kind of the formal title for this period of great hardship, really. But, I joined a succession of all of my previous successors thinking, oh, well, the whole thing's going to come crashing down now. There's no way these guys can possibly survive this, survive these blows. But by the time I actually left that position as ambassador 4 years later, Cuba had pulled back from the precipice. I think one of the byproducts of Cuban history, but also one of the byproducts of the decades of the U.S. trade and investment embargo has actually been to reinforce a quite remarkable resilience, self-reliance, and self-sufficiency in Cuban society, which has quite profound consequences. And where, despite being collectively tired, very tired, the Cuban people, they've weathered crisis after crisis of various kinds over decades. Cuba is a kind of it's a very homegrown, it's a do-it-yourself economy and experience. There are no members of the Cuban political leadership who are, have Harvard MBAs. They're all, they've created this themselves. They've done it with virtually no outside help, but they're smart, they're focused, and they're serious. The assumption in the government of Canada for many years that lay at the heart of the policy of constructive engagement was that this quite special and unique relationship between Canada and Cuba would give Canada privileged access to the Cuban political leadership and, as a corollary, leverage to encourage political reform and progress on the human rights agenda. But I subsequently concluded, after having been in that world for a long time, I subsequently concluded that this was rather, in fact, a quite self-serving piece of foreign policy mythology that we had developed for ourselves. Access to a healthy dialogue on areas of disagreement, yes, absolutely. But leverage, no. The Cuban leadership is, in fact, quite impervious to external pressures, to threats, to coercion. They make their decisions about the pace of evolution, about the kinds of political trade-offs that they will contemplate for their own internal Cuban political reasons, for their own assessment of their own politics, and not because, of course, Canada or the United States or the European Union has told them to do so. So I think this is, to some good measure, the history of Cuba speaking. So I'll stop there.
Mark, thank you very much. You told me ahead of time that you wouldn't be speaking on behalf of Cuba, and of course, how could you? But you did a very good job of explaining how things are seen there. And we could have. We talked about having the Cuban ambassador to the United States join you on the panel. Yeah. He unfortunately couldn't make it. But maybe just as well, because we wouldn't have any time for Q&A if we'd had him up here as well. So let's get into that. David Nelson, yes? Good to see you, David.
Good to see you again. Welcome back.
Thank you. Identify yourself for everybody else.
Thank you. David Nelson with GE. Let me ask a hypothetical question.
Yeah.
Let's say, digging into this question of the internal roadblocks to the opening, to the change, policy change. We all saw some of the rhetoric coming out of the Party Congress, Fidel pushing back against it, some of the other old guard, the comments about the direction they're going. And yet they still seem to be moving in the direction of exploring it. What are the internal roadblocks specifically? Let's say that the Cuban government had to make a decision on a significant transaction with an unnamed major U.S. corporation. And they had to...
Two letters.
And they had to, but of a level that would go to the top levels.
Yes.
How do you see the lineup in terms of where the push, where the pro and contra would be within the leadership? And the second question, totally unrelated.
Yeah.
When is EDC going to reopen in Cuba?
I'll do the second one first. EDC was just there. I don't speak for them, of course. Had the Canadian Commercial Corporation has long been much more active in Cuba. EDC has had historic and traditional arrears challenges. But as you may have noticed, in the spirit of bilateral debt renegotiations with Japan, Mexico, Russia, which the Cubans completed in quite marathon sessions over the last year and a half, and then the agreement with the Paris Club. There is a quite concerted effort, in my estimation, on the part of Cuba to clean up its foreign debt situation. If you're returning to the capital markets, you can't have a lot of this overhang. And I think I would suspect, not having insider knowledge of the conversations, but I would suspect that but I see these guys around quite a bit. I suspect that they're working out something with EDC, and CCC is also quite involved. On the other question, and it's a very interesting one, because my assessment is that the much more interesting and quite critical piece of political discourse around the Congress and the party was actually the opening speech of Raul Castro, which was fairly lengthy. And for those, I'm sure virtually nobody in this room, except maybe some, but maybe me, I actually listened to it and read it all. And it was a very interesting speech, because it was the most political speech I've heard a Cuban political leader give in a long time. It was the kind of speech that any Western politician would give to a ruling party or their party that was restless. And one could think as an analogy, maybe, a Margaret Thatcher giving a speech to the Conservative Party in Britain, in her darker times. Raul Castro really had to thread the needle. Because the party is not divided in any way, but it is a party where the conservative wing, shall we say, is nervous, agitated, worried. They are seeing the changes that are underway in the country and are unsure of the role that they themselves will play going forward, and the social costs and all of that kind of stuff. Then you have a more, for lack of a better word, progressive doesn't do it. It's not a progressive wing of the Communist Party of Cuba. They're evolutionists, who believe that maybe adaptation is not moving fast enough. And Raul Castro spoke very specifically to both sides. And he explained to the evolutionists, all the reasons why things weren't maybe moving as fast as someone would like. And he spoke to the more conservative part of the party, and he said a number of things. He said, of course, Cuba was not going to become a capitalist country, so you can sleep at night. But he did say that, all that private sector, those cuentapropistas, those urban cooperatives, they play an absolutely critical role in the current economy and the future of the country, and you have to treat them with respect. And on the relationship with the United States, he said several things. He said, we will continue to move in good faith in normalizing the relationship with the United States, because it is in the best interest of the country, of both countries, of peoples. He did say, though, however, that he denoted a certain political narrative in the certain policies around support for the private sector that seemed to be politically loaded. And he did say, I'm paraphrasing, we're not stupid in Havana, we're on to you. Putting that aside, that was a much more important speech, that kind of nuanced speech, which effectively, and the message was, and there were no big personnel changes. Frankly, I didn't expect any. I thought that people who did expect some were dreaming in Technicolor. I think it is steady as she goes, follow the plan, go forward. But in exactly the way that I described it before. The Fidel piece was a piece of history. I would pay a lot more attention to Raul speaking. I think it will certainly continue in their kind of measured way. I believe that they will do significant deals with American companies. I think they want to do that. They have adopted a policy of economic development which is effectively summed up though as diversification of reliance, that I would say. So not every American company will be able to do what it wants to do. And frankly, not every American company is in the sectors in which the Cubans are even interested. A certain large American company with 2 letters is involved in a number of things which I think the Cubans would be very interested in. I think when the conversation takes place at the cabinet table, the exact same litmus test is applied. How much, at what valuation, and which partner? And I think that will be effectively it. I think there's no real indication that there's a move backwards. I think they are moving forward. I think there is a requirement in terms of buttressing political legitimacy to be seen by the Cuban people to be moving forward. So there's a whole political narrative around this. So that's my assessment.
Thanks very much, Mark. We've got some more questions here. Go to the gentleman in the 4th row next to the IISS sign in the window there. Wait for the microphone to come. Okay. Go to the gentleman here in the 3rd row in the blue, light blue shirt.
Ken Meyercord, World Docs. I have a theory as to why we're in that, what you call gray area, where we're trying to normalize relations at the same time keeping the embargo in place. And it relates to what motivated the change in our policy. I don't think it was any epiphany as to the dead-end aspect of our 50-year-old policy. I think it was the appearance of Russian bombers over the Caribbean for the first time since the Cold War. And if this was the case, our policy would be to string the Cubans along with the prospect of ending the embargo so that they won't grant a refueling base to those Russian bombers, as they've had in the past. But at the same time, not giving up on our attempt to prevent the Cuban Revolution from succeeding. Well,
the short answer is I don't know. It's an excellent theory, and there are all kinds of other theories at play, of course. I also think that it's in the backdrop to certainly the political assessment in the United States is the realization that the political dynamics, the electoral dynamics have changed quite significantly. President Obama was able to win Florida without the old Cuban American vote. Young Cuban Americans are migrating in fairly large numbers to the Democratic Party. There's a rationale in and around this, in addition to sort of the time has come piece. So I don't know. The Russians are back in and around Cuba, of course, by the way, but in an infinitely different way than they were before. Largely commercial. They have extended lines of credit to the Cubans to refurbish the large hydroelectric stations. There may be some robustness in, for example, Russian military presence in Latin America in general, which is in the context of the sparring between the United States and Russia. From my own professional background, I would have every reason to believe that's probably the case. However, I don't think there's one iota of thought in Cuba, certainly, of returning to any kind of military relationship with Russia in any way in the hemisphere. The Cubans perceive themselves much more, I think, as a Latin American country in the Caribbean, with a long-term set of interests with a whole range of countries, but also with the United States. From a Cuban perspective, in terms of their own rationale in coming to this to the table, you often hear too in the United States, oh well, the Cubans are they're going to lose the Bolivarian oil subsidy from Venezuela, so they're desperate, and they're in desperation, they have to turn to the United States to keep the ship afloat. This is not how the Cubans think, I can assure you. This is not the Cuban rationale whatsoever. I think they have made a very, very rational decision on their part that it is in the national interest of the country to have a better relationship. They would like that the embargo gone. They would like the embargo gone so they can do some proper business with American companies, but they'd also like the embargo gone, and I don't think this is no state secret that I'm revealing, but they also like the embargo gone because of the extraterritorial reach. They need access to capital pools. They would like access to the world's largest capital pools in the United States. But the extraterritorial reach of the U.S. embargo has also severely hindered their access to capital around the world, with the exception of, for example, the Chinese and Vietnamese and that kind of thing. So it's a very kind of rational approach. It's just sort of the time has come. But a return to any kind of military dimension involving the Russians, I don't believe that's part of any mix.
Okay, thanks very much, Mark. Lady in the front, and then we'll go to you, sir, in the back. Maybe we take two of them together here, if we could.
Thank you very much for your comments. Jordan Valdez from the Podesta Group. You talked earlier about the will of the Cuban people to participate in the value of their economy and in everything that's happening, and that's also something that we've seen. I was wondering if you would comment on what you see as the likelihood or the possibility of some of that desire for participation to ease up in the form of a little bit less control for the private sector to maneuver more freely. Our companies would like to be able to hire directly. They would like to be able to own larger portions of their investment. They would like to be able to move more freely and are still exhibiting some of that very strong control. And I see there being more than a fine line of difference between participation and continued control. Could you just comment on that?
Do you want to, can we take two, or would you?
Well, there's several.
Okay,
I wouldn't mind.
That's,
There's several pieces in that.
Okay, go ahead.
To unpack that slightly, a couple of things. The default starting place, and here let me talk about large-scale direct foreign investment that's governed by Law 118, the Foreign Investment Law. The starting place for the Cubans is their version of participation, or their definition of participation, is to own 51%, as you know, 5149. However, in non-strategic sectors, that is a relative moving target, and frankly is subject to negotiation of a deal. There is now precedent for joint ventures that, you could 60-40, and it's part of the negotiation, and partly that will depend on the degree to which the Cubans see the strategic need for that partnership, where they can't do it themselves, they don't have access to appropriate capital. There has been probably some learning pains around how to deal with valuation issues that help to set some of this equity participation in joint partnerships, where, and I've told the Cubans this many times, so it'll come as no surprise, I think they have tended, and still probably do to a large extent, but although getting better and better, to underestimate the cost of capital. Capital is like those little mercury balls that will flow into the path of least resistance, and but it's kind of a learning process. Where you have the most resistance around majority equity ownership is in a concept that was introduced in 118 that didn't really exist before, and that is in strategic national assets. Mineral resources, utilities, that kind of thing, where Cuban foreign investment policy, at least for the time being, is to hold pretty rigidly at 5149. You can, of course, have 100% foreign-owned companies, as you know. You can have them in certain strategic sectors like renewable energy. You can have them at Mariel, Special Economic Zone, etc. The other piece to unpack from that, and something to watch, and something that Raul Castro talked about explicitly at the Party Congress, which just today, in fact, saw some movement on, which is the definition or the something that they needed to do to give legal definition to the private sector. because the way the private sector had worked in the past in Cuba, what we call the private sector, was really under a series of these cuenta propista regulations, which are effectively self-employment regulations. These are folks who operated under a license from the state. It was like a certificate, like a driver's license, effectively, but they had no legal status. Without legal status as a company, so you couldn't form an actual corporation. Without legal status, of course, you would not have import-export authorities. You would not have the right to receive direct foreign investment. They are now moving, and the devil will be in the detail, but this is fairly significant, to go to your point about starting to kind of let things flow a bit more. If the implication is as it seems, or the consequence is as implied, I guess is the way to put it, this will provide now formal legal status in the Cuban system to private companies, which means they can actually exist shoulder to shoulder with state companies. And presumably, I haven't read regs, I don't even think they've drafted regs. This is the aspirational commitment, but it implies that they will be able to operate as any other company, be registered presumably in the Mercantile Registry of the Chamber of Commerce, et cetera, et cetera. This could change the landscape quite significantly in Cuba, and quite interesting.
Thank you, Mark. We're going to go over just a little bit. If anybody needed to leave at 3, you can leave without any penalty. Gentleman in the back row.
Mr. Ambassador, my name is Mark Shaheen. Just as context, I served as a U.S. diplomat in Havana just after your tenure.
Oh.
So I appreciate your remarks, especially you're capturing the context of how complicated and multifaceted Cuban society is. I don't think people get a picture of that here through the media, which tends to be, fairly lazy and cliched kind of reports out of Cuba. But I came to believe quickly that all of the talk of sort of socialism in a new era, or communism, where everything was all sort of had become rather silly, and that the only political philosophy left in Cuba from the top generation and top cadre of the leadership was really keeping power, and that would continue, and that these reforms, which have been going off and on in various ways for 15 or 20 years, will continue to be adjusted and tinkered with, but within that top cadre of leadership, that the continued philosophy will be, what do we need to do to maintain power? But that also is changing. My sort of peers generationally within official Cuban government actually had a very different view. And so, I'd like to know if you agree with that this next generation of leadership, once the actuarial tables catch up with the Castros and the tight group around them, if you see a different attitude still, like I used to. The second thing I just want to say very briefly is I appreciated your comments on the lack of leverage that engagement gave. It's very rare that I've heard European or Canadian diplomats sort of say that publicly. The U.S. diplomats were quite frank at the lack.
Not serving anymore.
Right. We were always quite frank about the lack of leverage we had through our policy, but I found that actually quite true. And that maybe the lesson for this administration is that once all of this memory fades of the visit, is that we actually have very little leverage as well. And if you would comment on what my view is, which is the one thing that's actually fundamentally changing Cuban society. We came to believe that Cubans they weren't stupid by any stretch of the imagination. They didn't know what the truth was, but they knew they were being lied to. And technology is actually changing that. And the ability for communications, even in the last decade, and I think this will continue exponentially, for Cubans to actually have more information than they've had in the past. That's what's fundamentally changing and eroding the somewhat limited power that the party and the state has had over Cubans. And if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah. Again, a whole bunch of stuff there, and thank you for that. With regard to your first comments and the kind of the core or the core modus operandi of the Cuban government, I believe there's several things going on. Number one, the Cuban political leadership are not particularly ideologues. I think this is a very important point. They're not dogmatic. They tend to be high pragmatists, which has meant that the concepts of Cuban socialism are relatively malleable and adaptable to changing circumstances. And it goes a bit to my earlier point about Cuba being kind of a hybrid fusion culture and an assimilator culture. This is really classic Cuban cultural foundations still at work. And I think that's very, very true. I believe that they are also consummate survivalists, and not essentially or fundamentally. And I've thought about this a lot over the years. Not essentially through the authoritarian abuse of state power, which one could often assume, and you hear that a lot, folks here and elsewhere. Infinitely more complicated than that. I think they are true believers, and I think this is the intergenerational part. They are true believers that they do continue a Cuban nationalist tradition. Now, given that, could the structure and form of that value proposition change over time? Absolutely. But I think that's the thing that unites the younger generation political leaders and the older generation ones, is this belief that because the revolution has been quite plastic wrapped up in La Bandera, in the La Patria, in Cuban nationalist symbolism, and I think that is a really important kind of sinew going forward, and they'll kind of move around within that. There is a generational shift just by chronology that is underway. You probably saw the age limitation announcements at the party Congress. While there are no details, and the devil is often in the details, but the aspirational intent is that by the next time this group convenes, which is every 5 years, which is sort of vaguely akin sort of to like the Vatican conclave. Well, actually, it's bigger than the conclave. The real conclave is a much inner circle of the political leadership. But as Raul Castro himself said, well, I think it's 70 for Politburo members and 60 for the Central Committee of the party. But he did say, we don't want to see the old guys around the next time around. You should be reading your favorite book or at home with your grandchildren. And it's time for a generational change. That kind of talk was new. He's stepping down as president of the country in 2018. There are new political elites forming, coming out of the provinces. I don't anticipate, though, fundamental ruptures in the perception of the historic role of the Cuban political class, which is embedded in kind of nationalist symbolism and all that kind of stuff. I think they will define, though, quite easily and readily what that means and where they go. So that's kind of one thing, and I think it is. Having power is one thing, but I do think there is a deeper sense of a belief that that there are purposes and things to protect here. I think they actually believe that to a large extent. On the other piece about technology and things like that, absolutely. Cuba's changing before our eyes. They all know it's changing before our eyes. I think this is one of the reasons why the more conservative wing of the party is quite restless and nervous. Cubans are actually quite knowledgeable about things that are going on. But again, it goes to my earlier point where one has to be very, I think, careful about a causal linear kind of equation that goes more information equals political unrest equals kind of regime change, that kind of linear style equation. Because what I've noticed when I talk to lots of Cubans, and even, Cubans in urban professional class who are, tired and they're no great fans of the current structures and all this kind of stuff. They're very, change is one thing, but they also don't kind of want to throw the baby out with the bathwater of some stuff that they've actually done well. And they live in this kind of world where there's some stuff they actually like and other pieces they don't like. And I think the more and more information will change the way Cuban society works. 100% it will. I don't think, though, that it will accelerate or decelerate Cuban decisions on fundamental political evolution, in my opinion.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to ask the final question. Mark, you characterized the trade and investment embargo on Cuba as, quote, the most extensive ever devised. I've heard very similar words used about the sanctions on Iran, something I pay a lot of attention to,
yeah.
which were truly extraterritorial in their reach. And my question is, the Iran sanctions have proven very difficult to unravel because foreign banks just don't want to touch Iran.
Right.
Now, I assume that Canadian businesses have been able to repatriate profits from Cuba and have been able to have channels of banking and so forth. But I'm wondering whether the December 17, 2014 decision has, in fact, been played out in practice. Has the intent to remove some of the prohibitions played out in practice, or like the Iran case, have foreign businesses just been wary of getting involved?
The short answer in the banking sector and financial sector in particular is exactly like Iran.
Really?
Fundamentally.
Okay.
And I think in general, as a generalization, the tweaks to the embargo, which could have or would permit certain transactions to take place, certain things to happen. I think in the banking community, both in the United States and internationally, the bankers just don't trust that the political winds won't shift around. The regs probably they find still quite kind of complex and confusing, and they are not going to take a chance. The extraterritorial reach is still very profound. Canadian banks, for example, which are the ones I know the best, if you have Cuba, US dollar, any kind of anything, even in the same breath that it's sharing the same molecule of oxygen, they will not go near this because of absolutely shut down. So what you have in Cuba still to this day are very, very, very small, peripheral kind of banking operations. The net effect is very similar to Iran.
Well, with that, thank you very much, Mark. Thank you for enlivening us all about your experiences, about Canada's experience, about what businesses represented here can look forward to. Some of the political, not reforms, but evolution.
That's just me. You can do whatever you want.
I'm sorry we didn't have time to ask you about the origins of baseball in Cuba, but we can maybe chat about that afterwards. Please join me all in thanking Ambassador Anguissa.
Thank you. Just on the origins of baseball, not because they love baseball, because it was anti-Spanish. It could have been cricket. Hello. Hello.
Nice to meet you. I'm Sandra Flores from the Pan American
Yes,
Foundation.
hi. I'm going to see John later.
You're going to see John later.